Under the dim streetlights of Tampa, an anonymous threat reached Prosecutor Pam Bondi, a blank, unmarked, and signed piece of paper with only one chilling warning. Stop before it's too late. But too late for whom? Pam knew she had touched something more dangerous than ever. A multimillion-dollar embezzlement, a web of power that had run the entire justice system. And now, she was the target. Inside the courtroom, Judge Howard Gates sat comfortably in his chair, his fingers tapping idly on the table, his eyes scornful as he looked at Pam. "Prosecutor Bondi, I hope you're not too worried about this case," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. But Pam was undaunted. She was prepared for this fight, a fight not just against Charles Lawson, the embezzler of government funds, but to expose the truth about a corrupt system that had been in place for too long. As she placed the file on the table, the jury began to exchange anxious glances. But then a text message popped up on Pam's phone. "Your witness has disappeared." She froze, then quickly regained her composure. This was no ordinary case. This was a life-or-death battle. Someone was manipulating this trial from the shadows, and she wasn't going to let them win. Amid the tension, Pam Bondi pulled out a small USB drive and plugged it into the courtroom's projection system. A recording filled the courtroom. Make sure Bondi never gets those accounting books. A deadly silence fell over the room. All eyes turned to Judge Gates. His face was pale. For the first time, this powerful man showed a hint of panic. And then, the courtroom door swung open. A group of federal marshals entered, reading the arrest warrant. Howard Gates struggled, screaming in desperation. "No, you can't do this. I'm the one who makes the law here." But the cold sound of handcuffs rang out, ending the career of a man who thought he was above justice. But as he was taken away, a faint smile appeared on his lips. "You don't know anything yet." That whisper crept into Pam's ears like a terrifying warning. Gates was just a pawn, and the real mastermind behind it all is still out there. This story has only just begun. A huge network of corruption is slowly being exposed. But can Pam Bondi get to the bottom of the truth? Or will she become the next victim? If you want to know what happens next, don't forget to subscribe to Black Footprints to discover the shocking truths behind this mysterious curtain. Under the dim street lights of Tampa, Pam Bondi sat silently in her car, her eyes fixed on the piece of paper in her hand. A blank piece of paper, no signature, no markings, just a cold warning. Stop before it's too late. The night breeze crept in through the cracks in the windows, carrying the damp chill of the skyscrapers, but it did little to ease the unease that was spreading through her. This wasn't the first time she'd received a threat. When she'd been involved in high-profile corruption investigations, especially those involving powerful people, she'd become accustomed to intimidation tactics. But this time there was something different. Not the substance, but the timing. Just before the trial of Charles Lawson, a disgraced real estate developer accused of embezzling millions of dollars from the government. Even more serious, Lawson wasn't acting alone. Behind him was a network of powerful officials, whom she suspected had been manipulating the justice system for years. Pam clenched the paper before stuffing it into her bag, took a deep breath, opened the car door, and strode quickly into the office. She had no time to worry. Tomorrow, she would face one of the most difficult challenges of her career. The man presiding over the trial was none other than Judge Howard Gates, a man known for his unpredictable rulings and blatant bias. The next morning, the trial took place in a large courtroom, where the bright lights reflected off Gates' gold-rimmed glasses as he leaned back in his chair, arms folded, surveying the room with an unruffled air. As Pam stepped up to the podium, a mocking smile crossed his lips. "Prosecutor Bondi, you seem nervous. I hope you're not too worried about this case," he said, his voice booming, each word sounding like a sarcastic remark. A few people in the courtroom exchanged knowing glances. Gates was no stranger to controversial decisions. He was known not only for his unusual sentencing, but also for his blatant favoritism toward the powerful. Pam didn't let herself waver. She had prepared herself for this. She opened her briefcase, her eyes darting sharply to Lawson, the salt-and-pepper-haired man sitting at the defense table in a perfectly tailored suit, but with a cold, emotionless face. Your Honor, we have ample evidence to prove that the defendant Charles Lawson embezzled millions of dollars from the government with the help of a network of corrupt officials. Gates' lips twitched, then shrugged as if what she had just said was not worth worrying about. Well, Attorney Bondi, you seem very confident. But remember, this courtroom is not a stage for a performance. Let's get to the point. Pam clenched her jaw but kept her voice calm. It's pretty clear, Judge. We have illegal wire transfers, forged contracts, and testimony from an inside witness. Gates sighed, shook his head dramatically, and snapped his fingers. Oh, a secret witness? We all know that kind of witness is easy to bribe or coerce. Honestly, I don't see anything convincing about that. The mood in the courtroom turned heavy. Several jurors exchanged nervous glances, affected by Gates's disdain. Across the room, Lawson's defense attorney flashed a half-smile, as if he had seen this coming. But Pam was not to be cowed. She looked straight at Gates, sensing that he was more than just a biased judge. He might be part of the whole corrupt system. She knew this case was about more than Lawson. It is also about the people behind him, who have used their power to manipulate the law and enrich themselves. And she, despite the countless obstacles, despite the murky threats, will not stop. Because justice is not a game that she accepts to let the stronger person win. She will fight to the end. Pam Bondi felt the tension in the air in the courtroom, as if the room were being held in a storm that was about to erupt. She stood tall on the stand, her gaze steady as she scanned the jury. This was no longer just a trial against Charles Lawson. It was a battle against a corrupt system that was trying to hide the truth. Judge Howard Gates leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the wooden armrest, his demeanor lazy as if he were completely unconcerned with the charges Pam was presenting. Prosecutor Bondi, I'm trying to be patient, but I've yet to see any evidence that's strong enough. It's just numbers on paper. Anyone can make them up. His tone was laced with contempt, enough to create skepticism in the jury. Pam was unfazed. She knew Gates would do anything to twist this case, to undermine her evidence. But she also knew that the truth could not be buried in legal gimmicks. She stepped forward, holding a file high before the jury, her voice sharp and decisive. Over the past 2 years, the federal government has approved $240 million for Charles Lawson's development projects. But if you look closely at these financial transactions, you will see that nearly half of the money has disappeared. There are no legal records of these payments, and none of the buildings have been built on schedule. So where did all this money go? Gates raised his eyebrows, feigning a yawn, as if bored by her argument. Well, that's interesting. But this isn't a crime show. Do you have any stronger evidence? Pam didn't blink. She put the file down, flipped quickly to a specific page, and pushed it toward the court clerk. I have evidence of wire transfers between Lawson's company and several offshore shell entities. These accounts all lead to individuals with government connections. Lawson's defense attorney laughed, folding his arms in a haughty manner. What a sensational story. But, Your Honor, this is still just the prosecutor's theory. The jury began to exchange glances, some frowning, others looking at Gates with suspicion. No one laughed anymore. But then everything changed abruptly. One of Pam's assistants hurried over to her, silently handing her a small USB drive. His voice was low enough for her to hear. It just arrived at the office. An anonymous witness said we need to look into it right away. Pam quickly plugged the USB drive into her computer, her eyes glued to the screen as the files appeared. She scrolled through a series of financial statements, anonymous transactions, vast sums of money flowing through elaborate layers of cover. But what stunned her was an unexpected name. Howard Gates. She clenched her fists. It was clear now. Gates wasn't just a biased judge. He was part of the system. Before she could react, another message appeared on her screen. It was unsigned, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. I can give you more evidence, but I'm in danger. I can't testify. Be careful. Just then her phone buzzed. Another brief message. Your witness has disappeared. A chill ran through Pam's body. She looked up at Gates, and he was still sitting there, as if he knew everything. The game had changed, and she couldn't stop. The air in the courtroom was thick as a storm before storm. All eyes were on the stand, where Pam Bondi stood, clutching a stack of documents. She knew this was the most important moment of the case, a decisive move that could make or break everything. Walking slowly toward the stand, she stopped in front of the evidence table, her eyes scanning the room before setting the files down. Your Honor, this document is a financial contract signed by Judge Howard Gates. The words cut through the air like a sharp knife, plunging the courtroom into a deadly silence. Gates, who had maintained his arrogant and disdainful demeanor, froze. His eyelids twitched, but he regained his composure in a split second. Pam continued. This contract confirms that Judge Gates received $3 million from an offshore investment fund run by a shell company. And if you'll notice, this company is directly connected to Charles Lawson. A few murmurs rose from the audience. A few reporters leaned in, tapping furiously on their laptops. Camera flashes began to flash. Gates slammed the gavel down, his voice ringing out, sharp but with an unmistakable tremor. This document is invalid. I will not allow forged evidence in this courtroom. But Pam didn't let him get the better of her. She calmly turned to the last page of the contract, where a familiar signature was printed. Your Honor, this is Judge Gates's original signature, verified by an independent signature expert. No one can dispute this. A chorus of boos went up from the jury. All eyes were on Gates, who was trying to hide his embarrassment by leaning back in his chair. From the corner of the room, Lawson's defense attorney stood up. Your Honor, we object. The prosecutor is trying to defame a high-ranking official without any clear evidence. Pam tilted her head, smiling coldly. No clear evidence. She turned back to the court clerk. Please project this image onto the screen. Immediately, a series of bank statements appeared on the large screen. Among them, there were direct deposits from the hedge fund into Howard Gates' personal account. The atmosphere in the courtroom exploded. Unexpected betrayal. Just as the situation was tilting in the prosecutor's favor, something unexpected happened. One of Pam's closest colleagues, Jake Henderson, stood up, holding a stack of documents, and walked toward Judge Gates. Your Honor, I have something to say. Pam stared at Jake, sensing something was wrong. Jake slowly placed the file on Gates's desk. I would like to report that the evidence that Prosecutor Bondi just provided shows signs of tampering. I have another forensic report in my possession that shows that this signature does not exactly match Judge Gates's official signature. Murmurs spread around the room. Gates blinked, looking at Jake with amusement. He had just been handed a chance to escape. Pam clenched her fists. What the hell are you doing, Jake? She growled, her eyes dark. Jake didn't look at her, just shrugged. Just the facts. But Pam had been prepared for this. She flipped her file to another page, an audio recording. Sorry, Jake, but I guess you forgot that our computer system has a document tracking system. I have a copy of the email you sent last night to Lawson's attorney. The silence was deafening. Jake paled. He stammered something, but Pam quickly motioned for the court assistant to turn on the tape recorder. Jake's voice echoed through the room. I sent you a copy of the contract Bondi is going to present. If Judge Gates were to reject it, this case would collapse. A heavy silence passed. Then, Gates stood up. For the first time in the entire trial, he couldn't hide his fear. Sweat beaded on his forehead. All eyes were on him. Everyone in the courtroom had realized the undeniable truth. The jury exchanged glances. Reporters were preparing for a breaking story. Pam Bondi stood still, watching silently. Gates' game was up, and he knew it. The court adjourned, but the atmosphere was still as tense as a string, as if just a small spark could cause everything to explode. Outside, a crowd of reporters were bustling, constantly recording and reporting on the shocking developments that had just occurred. Photos of Pam Bondi's financial evidence had flooded the news sites, creating a media storm. Inside the courtroom, she still stood there, not taking her eyes off Howard Gates. She could feel the heat of the invisible confrontation that was taking place between the two. Gates, who always maintained an arrogant and calm demeanor, was now tapping his fingers lightly on the table, a small but enough sign to reveal his restlessness. His cold gaze swept across the room before stopping on Pam's face. After a moment of consideration, he nodded slightly, signaling her to step closer to the judge's podium. Pam did not hesitate. She walked forward, each step slowly but firmly, her eyes never leaving her opponent. She could see the tension behind his calm exterior. He wasn't just worried, he was genuinely scared. Gates leaned in, his voice low, just loud enough for her to hear. Some battles aren't worth fighting, Bondi. I advise you to stop before it's too late. The warning was soft, almost a suggestion, but there was a cold threat in it. Pam knew this kind of threat well. She'd heard it before, from men in power, and those who believed they were above the law. But she didn't blink, didn't flinch. I'm not easily intimidated, sir. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were bright, as sharp as a knife just drawn from its sheath. Gates narrowed his eyes, displeased with her reaction. He was used to being in control, used to people bowing to his authority. But Pam Bondi wasn't one of them. Outside, whispers began to spread throughout the courtroom. The public was whispering, the press was asking questions. More importantly, the jury was beginning to look at Gates with suspicion. And he sensed it. But instead of continuing to threaten, Gates decided to play another move, one that he believed could turn the tide. The court denies the prosecutor's motion. His voice grew louder, more forceful, as if to drown out the lingering doubts. The evidence is insufficient. The trial will continue with more appropriate arguments. The courtroom fell silent. Pam clenched her fists. She wasn't surprised. Gates was doing what she had expected, trying to control the situation, trying to close any openings before everything fell apart. But she saw the signs of a man about to collapse. And just then, a courthouse security guard quietly approached her. His voice was so low it was almost a breath. "Prosecutor Bondi, I have something to tell you about the surveillance system." Pam turned, sensing a new wave of tension creeping into the air. The security cameras in the courtroom were tampered with prior to the trial. She frowned slightly. "Tam-Tao," the guard lowered his voice even further. "There's a video that was deleted, one that shows Judge Gates having a secret meeting with Charles Lawson just prior to this trial." Pam stood still, sensing that this power play was more dangerous than she'd thought. Gates wasn't just protecting Lawson. He had something bigger to hide. But now, Pam knew she had the key to his overthrow. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, every breath heavy, every gaze focused on Pam Bondi. She stood firmly on the stand, her face calm, but her eyes as sharp as a knife just drawn from its sheath. This was the decisive moment, the moment to end the game she had been persistently pursuing to the end. Taking a deep breath, Pam slowly picked up a small USB drive and plugged it into the court's projection system. There was no need to rush. She knew that what was on the USB drive would completely change the situation. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and decisive, "I would like to present a recording." A click of a button. And then, Howard Gates' voice echoed throughout the courtroom. "Make sure Bondi never gets his hands on those ledgers." A deadly silence fell. Everyone was stunned. The jury froze. The reporters, who had been taking notes frantically, suddenly stopped. Even Charles Lawson's defense attorney, who had been protesting, didn't dare to speak. Pam scanned the room, seeing expressions of shock, confusion. But the most important reaction was from Howard Gates himself. His face lost all color. His fingers trembled as he gripped the edge of the table, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. A moment of bewilderment. A moment when Gates seemed unable to control the situation. And then he exploded. "Nonsense. It's a sham. This trial is a farce. I declare it null and void." His voice was shrill, no longer holding his usual composure. He slammed his gavel down on the table, the clanging of it echoing throughout the room. But this time, no one paid any attention to his orders. No one stood up to protest. No one was afraid of Gates's fake authority. Panic was written all over his face. Gates grabbed the papers in front of him, turning as if to leave, to escape the nightmare that was engulfing him. But before he could lift his foot from the chair, Pam Bondi spoke, her voice ringing with authority. "Where are you going, Judge? The trial is not over yet." Gates stopped short, but it was too late. As he turned, the courtroom doors swung open. A row of police officers entered, their steps resolute. One of them held up an arrest warrant with a bright red seal. The cold metal of the handcuffs glinted under the courtroom lights. "Howard Gates, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and bribery." Gates paled. He glanced around for an escape. There was no way back. And then he lunged for the door. A desperate attempt. A cornered animal. But the police were waiting. A snap of the wrists. The snap of the handcuffs. The courtroom exploded with whispers, the frantic snapping of photos from reporters. Flashbulbs flashed. The news would spread like wildfire. Gates slumped, head bowed. He knew his game was up. Pam Bondi stood still, staring straight at the scene before her, not bothering to hide the triumph in her eyes. The game was up, and justice had prevailed. The courtroom doors swung open. The sound of leather shoes hitting the floor echoed in the heavy space, each step decisive, as if signaling an irreversible verdict. A group of federal police officers entered, their faces cold, their sharp eyes scanning the crowd that was holding their breath. Leading the way was Special Agent Marcus Reed, who had spent years tracking the corruption hidden deep within the judicial system. He walked toward the podium. Without hesitation, his hand pulled out an arrest warrant, his voice resounding clearly. Each word seemed to nail into the air. "Howard Gates, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and criminal conspiracy." The entire courtroom exploded. Some gasped, some whispered, some hurriedly grabbed their phones and cameras, recording this unprecedented moment in history. A high-ranking judge being arrested right in court. But Gates refused to accept his fate. He roared, eyes blazing, completely out of control. "No, you can't do this. I'm a lawmaker here." Gates backed away, as if searching for a way out of this nightmare. He looked around, searching for an ally, those who had bowed before him. But this time no one spoke. The prosecutors, the lawyers, the government officials in the courtroom, all were silent. No more compromising handshakes, no more complicit glances. Pam Bondi crossed her arms, watching. She didn't have to say anything. Gates struggled, but then the sound of handcuffs tightening around his wrists. A police officer read his Miranda rights aloud. "Howard Gates, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in a court of law." Gates's face froze, his breathing quickened. His entire life of power, everything he had built, manipulated, hidden, was crumbling before his eyes. The jury looked at each other, some laughing softly, some still stunned, unable to believe what had just happened. Then applause. At first, just a few snickers. But then, the entire courtroom erupted in applause. Some cheered, some laughed, some turned to each other, eyes shining, as if they had just witnessed a historic moment. But as Gates was dragged away, he let out a faint smile. It wasn't the smile of a defeated man, but of a man who knew more than anyone thought. He looked up, his eyes darkening, and whispered loud enough for Pam Bondi to hear. "You don't know anything yet." Pam Bondi blinked, feeling a chill run down her spine. Gates is more than just a pawn, and perhaps this battle is not really over. The moment Gates was escorted out of the courtroom by the police, all eyes immediately turned to the one remaining man, Charles Lawson. He sat motionless, his face as white as a sheet, his hands gripping the edge of the defendant's table so tightly that his knuckles were white. Gates was out of the game, and now he was alone. Pam Bondi walked slowly toward the defendant's table, her footsteps echoing throughout the now silent room. Lawson swallowed. She stopped right in front of him, her hands on the table, her sharp gaze boring into his bewildered eyes. "Do you want to continue the trial?" she said, her voice soft but authoritative. "Or do you want to discuss a plea deal?" Lawson took a sharp breath, a bead of sweat sliding down his temple. He looked around, desperately searching for an escape. But this time, there was no Gates to save him. There was no one left to pull him out of the mess he had created. He was stuck. The jury was watching, the reporters were waiting, and the public was watching his every move. He knew this was the final straw. If he continued to resist, he could spend the rest of his life in prison, or worse, be killed by the very people he had been doing business with. Lawson trembled slightly. Finally, he nodded slowly. I, I'll cooperate, he said, his voice choking. But I need protection. I know more than you think. Pam narrowed her eyes, seizing the opportunity. Then you better start talking. New secrets revealed. In the ensuing negotiations, Pam discovered that Lawson was more than just a government embezzler. He was connected to a political underground, a network of power that Gates was only a small part of. The bigger names, the ones still in the shadows. Pam knows this battle isn't over. Gates has been eliminated, but the real mastermind behind it all has yet to be revealed. And now, Lawson is the key to unlocking that door. Bright lights streamed down from the ceiling, enveloping Pam Bondi as if she were standing in the center of a stormy political battlefield. The courtroom was still humming, whispers rolling in waves upon waves. The jury was stunned, reporters jostling to take notes, flashing cameras were flashing. But most of all, the public was watching her, waiting for an answer. Pam took a deep breath, stepped forward, her sharp eyes scanning the room. No more Gates, no more manipulation. For the first time in a long time, justice had a chance to speak, and she had no intention of stopping. She stood in the center of the courtroom, where all eyes were on her, where curious, hopeful, worried, and fearful eyes were waiting for something bigger. Then, her voice rang out, strong and decisive, cutting through the chaos of the room. This trial is just the beginning. We will continue to investigate to expose the truth. The words were like a spark. Outside the courthouse, the public exploded. The news was all over the newspapers. Judge Howard Gates arrested in court. A shocking corruption case. Prosecutor Pam Bondi announces further investigation. Who's next? A network of corruption may be about to be brought down. In the media, the whole country began to pay attention. Public opinion was boiling. They were no longer satisfied with a single arrest. They wanted more. They wanted the truth. New names began to appear in confidential reports. New evidence was revealed. The real monsters, manipulators from the shadows, were gradually brought into the light. Last image. Howard Gates was led away by the police, his hands cuffed, his face dark, but he was still muttering like a curse. This game is not over. Charles Lawson sat slumped in the dock, sweat streaming down his face pale. He knew he had no way back. Either he cooperated, or he would be the next victim. The press came in like a storm, surrounding the woman who had started it all, Pam Bondi. But she did not back down. She stood firm in the storm, her eyes steadfast, knowing that the real battle had only just begun. And she would not stop, because no one is above the law.